The sky burned orange and red as another orbital station exploded in the distance. Princess Alindra of the Volanti Empire stood at the tall windows of the royal palace and watched her civilization die piece by piece. Her people were beautiful. Creatures with silver skin and eyes like purple gems, and they had ruled this corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years. They were masters of art and music and healing, and they had created wonders that other species traveled across the stars just to witness, but they had never learned to fight. They had never needed to fight, because the galaxy had been peaceful for so long, and war seemed like something from ancient stories that parents told children to frighten them. Now the HFY had come. The HFY were massive reptilian warriors with scales like black armor and teeth like daggers, and they lived only for conquest and destruction. They had already burned 3 of the 12 Volanti worlds, and their fleet grew larger. With each passing day, as more of their warships arrived from the dark spaces between stars. "Daughter," the Empress said from behind. Alindra, and her voice was heavy with exhaustion and shame. Alindra did not turn around because she already knew what her mother was going to say. "The council has made a decision," the Empress continued, and Alindra could hear the tears that her mother was trying to hide. "Tell me," Alindra said. "The humans have offered us an alliance, but they want it sealed. In the old way, with a marriage between our houses and theirs." Alindra felt her heart sink into her stomach. Humans were the youngest species in the galaxy, and they had only been traveling among the stars for 300 years. Most of the elder races looked down on them as primitive and crude creatures who bred too fast and died too young and fought over foolish things. They had no psychic powers like the Volanti, and no natural weapons like the HFY, and no ancient wisdom like the Althari. They were just soft pink creatures with short lives and loud voices and a strange stubbornness that other species found annoying. "Who do they want me to marry?" Alindra asked. "A military commander named James Chun, and he specifically requested you after seeing your image during our diplomatic communications." Alindra closed her eyes and felt the weight of her duty pressing down on her shoulders. She was 500 years old and considered young among her people, and she had dreamed of finding love the way the old poems described it. Instead, she would be sold to a human who had seen her face and decided he wanted her like a merchant choosing fruit at a market. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow, and their fleet will arrive within the hour to provide protection while the ceremony takes place." Alindra finally turned to face her mother, and she saw that the Empress looked older than she ever had before. "I will do what I must for our people," Alindra said, and her voice did not shake even though her hands did. The Empress crossed the room and embraced her daughter, and they held each other as the sky continued to burn. The human fleet arrived exactly when they said they would. Alindra watched from the palace as 40 vessels dropped out of faster than light travel and took up defensive positions around the planet. They were ugly ships compared to the elegant bioships of the Volanti, with harsh angles and gray metal and weapons that jutted out like the spines of some angry beast. But there was something about the way they moved that made Alindra pause. They moved like predators, and they moved like creatures that were used to fighting and winning. The wedding took place in the great hall of the palace with representatives from a dozen species watching, and most of them looked at Alindra with pity or at the humans with contempt. Alindra wore the traditional silver gown of a Volanti bride, and she walked down the long aisle toward the altar where her future husband waited. James Chun was not what she had expected. He was of average height for a human, with dark hair that had turned gray at the sides and a face that showed the lines of age and experience. His eyes were dark brown, and they watched everything with a quiet intensity that reminded Alindra of the scholars who spent their lives studying the mysteries of the universe. He wore his military uniform, and it was simple and practical and covered with medals that she did not understand. When she reached the altar, he looked at her, and she waited for the hunger or the possessiveness that she expected to see in his gaze. Instead, she saw something that surprised her. She saw respect, and she saw sadness, and she saw a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said quietly so that only she could hear, and his voice was gentle in a way she had not expected. "I know what this costs you, and I will not pretend otherwise." Alindra did not know how to respond, so she simply waited for him to continue. "But I swear to you on my life, and on my honor, and on the memory of everyone I have ever loved, that your people will survive this war." He paused, and his eyes met hers. "Whatever it takes, and whatever I have to do, and whatever I have to become, I will keep your people safe." There was something in his voice that made Alindra believe him, even though she did not want to believe him. There was something that sounded like a promise made by someone who had never broken a promise in his life. The ceremony continued, and they spoke the words that bound them together. And when James placed the ring on her finger, his hands were steady and warm. Afterwards, there was a feast that Alindra barely tasted, and music that she barely heard, and diplomats who spoke words that she barely understood. All she could think about was the man who was now her husband, and the war that was coming, and the future that she could not see. Late that night, she stood alone on a balcony, looking up at the stars and wondering which of those distant lights would be the next to go dark. "You should sleep," a voice said from behind her, and she turned to find James standing in the doorway. "I could say the same to you," she replied. He smiled, and it was a tired smile that made him look very human and very old. "I have not slept well in many years," he admitted, and he walked over to stand beside her at the railing. "The war has already cost you much," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes," he said simply. They stood together in silence and watched the stars, and somewhere out there in the darkness, the Kethver were gathering their forces for the final assault. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" Alindra asked suddenly. James was quiet for a long moment. "Because your people deserve to live," he finally said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "And I have learned that sometimes the only way to save something beautiful is to stand between it and the darkness and refuse to move." Alindra looked at him, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. She saw the weight of all the battles he had fought, and all the losses he had suffered, and all the promises he had made and kept. And she realized that perhaps she had judged him too quickly. Perhaps there was more to this human than she had believed. Perhaps there was more to all of them. The human warship was called the Terran Resolve, and Alindra had never been aboard anything like it. She had expected something crude and rough and uncomfortable, because that was what everyone said about human technology. Instead, she found herself walking through corridors that hummed with power and purpose and filled with humans who moved like they knew exactly where they needed to be. James walked beside her and explained things as they went, and his voice was patient like a teacher who enjoyed sharing knowledge. "This is the main engineering deck," he said, as they passed through a massive room filled with machines that glowed with energy. "Our ships are not elegant like yours, but they are strong, and they are fast, and they do what we need them to do." Alindra looked around, and she noticed something strange about the human crew. They did not look at her with the pity or contempt that she had grown used to seeing from other species. They looked at her with curiosity and with respect, and several of them nodded or smiled as she passed. "Your people do not seem to hate me," she said, and she could not hide her surprise. James looked at her with confusion in his eyes. "Why would they hate you?" "Because I am not human, and because this marriage was forced upon both of us, and because most species think very little of the Volanti." James stopped walking and turned to face her, and his expression was serious. "My people do not judge others by their species," he said firmly. "We judge them by their actions and their character, and how they treat those who are weaker than themselves." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes. "We have been judged by others our entire existence among the stars, and we know what it feels like to be dismissed and underestimated. Alindra felt something shift inside her as she listened to his words. "Come," James said, and his voice was lighter now. "There is someone I want you to meet." He led her to a small room near the medical bay where an old woman sat in a chair with a blanket over her legs. Her hair was white as snow, and her face was wrinkled with age, but her eyes were sharp and bright and filled with life. "Mother," James said, and his voice was warm with affection. "This is Alindra." Old woman looked up at Alindra and studied her for a long moment. "She is even more beautiful than you described," the woman said, and then she smiled. "Welcome to the family, child." Alindra did not know what to say because she had not expected James to have family aboard his ship. "My mother refused to stay behind on Earth," James explained, and there was amusement in his voice. "She said she did not survive raising me just to miss out on the adventure. Someone has to keep you out of trouble," his mother said, and she reached out to take Alindra's hand. "Sit with me, child, and tell me about yourself, because my son is terrible at providing details." Alindra sat, and she talked and she listened, and she learned that James had been married before, and that his wife had died in a pirate attack 20 years ago. She learned that he had a son who died fighting in a war on the frontier when he was only 19 years old. She learned that James had kept fighting after each loss, because he believed that giving up would betray the memory of everyone he had loved. "He carries so much pain," his mother said quietly when James left to attend to his duties. "But he never lets it make him cruel, and he never lets it make him weak." She squeezed Alindra's hand. "You are good for him, and I can see it already in the way he looks at you." "He does not know me," Alindra protested. "No," the old woman agreed, "but he wants to know you, and that is a beginning." Over the following weeks, Alindra spent more time with James, and she learned things about humans that no diplomatic briefing had ever taught her. She learned that they only slept for 8 hours out of every 24, and that they spent the rest of their time working or talking, or pursuing hobbies that seemed strange to her. He learned that their bodies healed quickly from injuries that would take a Volanthe months to recover from. She learned that they willingly consumed substances that were poisonous to most species because it made them feel more alert or more relaxed. She learned that they engaged in activities that simulated danger for entertainment, and that they called these activities sports or games. "Why would anyone choose to feel afraid?" she asked James one evening as they shared a meal in his quarters. "Because fear makes us feel alive," he replied, and he smiled at her confusion. "Humans spent most of our existence being hunted by predators and fighting for survival against a world that wanted to kill us." He took a sip of the dark liquid he called coffee. "We learned to use fear instead of being controlled by it, and we learned that facing danger makes the peaceful moments more precious." Alindra thought about this for a long time. "Your species is very strange," she finally said. James laughed, and it was a warm sound that made something flutter in her chest. "Yes, we are," he agreed, "but strange is not always bad." He looked at her, and his eyes were soft in a way she had not seen before. "Your people created art that makes grown warriors weep with its beauty, and your healers have saved millions of lives across the galaxy, and your poets write words that other species have treasured for centuries." He reached across the table and took her hand. "That is not strange, and that is not weak, and that is precious beyond measure." Alindra felt tears prick at her eyes. "The Kethver think we are weak," she whispered. "The Kethver are fools," James said, and there was steel in his voice now. "They see your gentleness, and they think it means you cannot fight, but they do not understand that true strength is not about how hard you can hit." He squeezed her hand. "True strength is about what you are willing to protect and what you are willing to sacrifice and what you are willing to become for the sake of others." He stood and walked to the window where the stars stretched out in an endless field of light. "The Kethver will come soon," he said quietly, "and when they do, they will learn what humans are willing to do for those we have sworn to protect." There was something in his voice that made Alindra shiver, not with fear, but with something else, something that felt like hope. Alindra was jolted from sleep by the sound, and for a moment, she did not know where she was or what was happening. Then she remembered, and her blood turned cold. James was already on his feet and pulling on his uniform with practiced speed. "Stay." "Here," he said, and his voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. "No," Alindra replied, and she was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I need to see what is happening." James looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Then stay close." To me, the bridge of the Terran Resolve was controlled chaos when they arrived. Officers shouted reports, and screens flickered with data, and in the center of it all stood the tactical display showing what was coming. Alindra felt her legs go weak. The display showed a wall of red dots spreading across the darkness of space like blood seeping through water. 2,000 ships. Dreadnoughts and carriers and destroyers and assault cruisers, the largest Kethver fleet ever assembled. They brought everything, one of the officers said, and his voice was tight with fear. They want to end this once and for all. James walked to the center of the bridge and stood before the tactical display with his hands clasped behind his back. He studied the enemy formation for several seconds, and his face showed no fear and no doubt. "Signal all ships," he said, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Formation Omega-7, and all weapons hot." Alindra moved to stand beside him, and she stared at the overwhelming force arrayed against them. 40 human ships against 2,000. Kethver warships. "This is impossible," she whispered. James glanced at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was cold and hard and ancient, and it reminded her of the stories her people told about the predators that had once hunted them before they learned to reach the stars. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "you have never seen humans fight." The human fleet began to move, and Alindra watched in confusion as they broke from their defensive formation. They were not retreating, and they were not spreading out to avoid the enemy weapons. They were charging directly at the Kethver armada. "What are they doing?" she asked. And her voice came out as a whisper. "What we do best," James replied. The Terran Resolve shuddered as its engines roared to full power, and Alindra grabbed a railing to keep herself from falling. The acceleration was brutal, and she could feel the pressure pushing against her chest and making it hard to breathe. Around her, the human crew moved with practiced efficiency, and none of them showed any sign of fear or hesitation. "Enemy fleet opening fire," an officer reported. "Maintain course and increase speed." The ship rocked as weapons fire slammed into the shields and warning lights began to flash across every console. Alindra watched the tactical display as the human ships continued their insane charge. They were weaving through the enemy fire with movements that should have been impossible for vessels their size. They were dodging and spinning and rolling, and all the while they were getting closer and closer to the enemy fleet. "How are they doing this?" she asked. "Humans have faster reflexes than most species," James explained without taking his eyes from the display. "And we have spent 300 years learning how to fight against enemies who outnumber us." The first human ship reached the enemy formation, and instead of slowing down, it accelerated even faster. It plunged into the heart of the Kethver fleet like a knife into flesh, and its weapons blazed in every direction. Alindra watched in amazement as the small human vessel carved a path of destruction. 2 ships 10 times its size. "They are insane," she breathed. "Yes," James agreed, and there was pride in his voice. "That is one of our greatest advantages." The battle became a maelstrom of fire and metal and death. Human ships darted through the enemy formation, striking and retreating and striking again. They fought with a ferocity that Alindra had never witnessed from any species. They rammed enemy vessels and boarded them and fought hand to hand in the corridors. They sacrificed themselves to protect their comrades, and they kept fighting even when their ships were burning around them. But it was not enough. The Kethvar were too many and the humans were too few. One by one, the human ships began to fall. "We are losing," Alendra said, and despair crept into her voice. "Not yet," James replied. He turned to his communications officer. "Signal the Dauntless and tell Captain Morrison to execute Protocol 17. The officer went pale. "Sir, that will. I know what it will do." James cut him off. "Do it." Alendra watched the display as one of the human ships broke away from the battle and turned toward the Kethvar flagship. It was a massive vessel called the Worldbreaker, and it was 3 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that had burned 100 worlds. The human ship was tiny in comparison, but it was accelerating faster and faster, past any speed that Alendra had ever seen a ship achieve. "What is happening?" she asked. "Protocol 17, James said quietly. "We call it a relativistic kill vehicle." "I do not understand." James looked at her, and his eyes were sad. "Captain Morrison is going to ram his ship into the enemy flagship at 4% of the speed of light." Alendra felt the blood drain from her face. "But his crew knows what they signed up for," James finished. On the display, the human ship continued to accelerate, and the Kethvar tried desperately to shoot it down, but it was moving too fast. Then it hit. The impact was brighter than a star. The Worldbreaker and the human ship both vanished in a flash of light, so intense that the sensors on the Terran Resolve went blind for several seconds. When they came back online, the Kethvar flagship was gone, and so was most of their command structure. The enemy fleet was in chaos. Their leaders were dead, and their communications were scrambled, and they did not know what to do, and the humans were not done yet. "All ships," James commanded, "press the attack." The destruction of the Worldbreaker had thrown the Kethvar into confusion, but they still outnumbered the humans by more than 50 to 1. James knew that destroying ships from a distance would not be enough to win this battle. He needed to cut the head off the snake. "Launch the boarding torpedoes," he commanded. "Target the secondary command ship." Alendra watched as dozens of small craft burst from the human vessels and streaked toward the Kethvar fleet. They were not elegant or graceful, and they looked like metal coffins with engines attached. "What are those?" she asked. "Our way inside," James replied. He turned to his first officer. "Commander Williams, you have the bridge." Alendra felt her heart stop. "You are going with them." "I am leading them," James said, and he was already moving toward the door. "This is my responsibility." "James, wait." He stopped and turned to look at her. Alendra did not know what to say, because she did not understand the feelings that were churning inside her. She had known this man for only a few weeks, and she had married him out of duty and desperation, but the thought of him dying made something inside her ache in a way she had not expected. "Come back," she finally said. James smiled, and it was a gentle expression that softened his hard features. "I will try." Then he was going. Alendra turned back to the tactical display and watched as the boarding torpedoes approached the Kethvar secondary command ship. It was a massive vessel called the Deathbringer, and it was almost as large as the Worldbreaker had been. The torpedoes hit the hull and burrowed through the metal like insects digging into flesh. "Patch me through to the boarding party," Alendra commanded. The communications officer hesitated. "Your Highness, I'm not sure." "Do it." The officer complied, and suddenly the bridge was filled with the sounds of battle gunfire and explosions and screaming and the clash of metal against metal, and through it all, she could hear James' first squad take the left corridor and second squad on me. Contact front 20 meters. Keep moving and do not stop for anything. Alendra listened as the humans fought their way through the Kethvar ship. She heard them call out warnings to each other, and she heard them cry out in pain when they were hit, and she heard them keep fighting even when they should have fallen. The Kethvar were massive creatures that stood 3 meters tall and weighed as much as 4 humans. Combined, their scales were like armor, and their claws could tear through metal, and their teeth could Crushbone by every measure, they should have been unstoppable in close combat, but the humans did not seem to care about what should have been. They fought with a fury that bordered on madness. And they used every weapon at their disposal, guns and knives and grenades and their bare hands, if nothing else was available. Elandra watched through the helmet cameras that were patched through to the bridge, and she saw things that would haunt her dreams for centuries. She saw James take a blade through his shoulder and keep fighting. She saw him get hit by plasma fire that burned through his armor, and he did not slow down. She saw him grab a HFY warrior by the throat and crush its windpipe with his bare hands. She saw him stand over wounded Marines and refuse to give ground, even when he was outnumbered 10-1. How is this possible? She whispered. Commander Williams stood beside her, and his voice was quiet. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day, he explained. Predators and diseases and natural disasters in each other. He paused as another explosion shook the enemy vessel on the screen. We survived by being too stubborn to die and too angry to give up. But the HFY are stronger. Strength is not everything, Williams replied. Humans are persistent predators, and our ancestors hunted by following prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. He gestured at the screen where James was leading his Marines deeper into the enemy ship. We do not need to be stronger, and we do not need to be faster, and we just need to keep going when everything else is stopped. On the screen, James and his Marines reached the command deck of the HFY vessel. The enemy commander was a massive creature covered in golden armor and surrounded by his elite guards. He roared a challenge in his own language, and Elindra did not need a translator to understand the contempt in his voice. James did not respond with words. He responded with violence. The battle was brief and brutal, and when it was over, James stood alone among the bodies of the fallen. His armor was cracked and burned and covered in blood, both red and black. His left arm hung at a wrong angle, and his face was cut in a dozen places, but he was alive, and the HFY command was dead. Bridge, this is Commander Chun. His voice came through the speakers, and it was hoarse with exhaustion. The secondary command ship is ours, and signal the fleet to concentrate fire on the remaining enemy capital ships. The effect on the battle was immediate, with both command ships destroyed. The HFY fleet had no coordination and no leadership. The human ships tore into them with renewed fury, and the enemy began to scatter. Within an hour it was over. The HFY survivors fled into faster-than-light travel and left behind the burning wreckage of more than 1,000 ships. They, humans, had lost 8 vessels, 8 ships against 1,000. Elindra watched the retreating enemy signatures disappear from the display, and she could not believe what she had witnessed. The youngest species in the galaxy had just defeated the most feared warriors known to exist, and they had done it through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She thought about James fighting on that enemy ship with wounds that should have killed him. She thought about Captain Morrison driving his vessel into the enemy flagship. Without hesitation, she thought about all the humans who had died today so that her people could live, and she finally understood what made humans so dangerous. It was not their technology, and it was not their tactics, and it was not their numbers. It was their will, their absolute refusal to surrender no matter the odds, their willingness to sacrifice everything for those they had sworn to protect. The Belanti had spent 10,000 years creating beauty and wisdom and art. Humans had spent their entire existence learning how to fight and die and take their enemies with them. And somehow these two species had found each other at the moment when both were needed. Mostalindra made a decision. Then she would find James, and she would thank him, and she would tell him that she no longer saw this marriage as a burden. She would tell him that she was proud to stand beside him, whatever came next. He was sitting on an examination table while doctors worked on his injuries, and he was arguing with them about treating his Marines first. Commander Chun, you have a broken arm and second-degree burns, and at least 3 cracked ribs, the chief medical officer said with obvious frustration. Private Kowalski has internal bleeding. James replied stubbornly, "Treat him first." "We already treated him, and now it is your turn." James opened his mouth to argue further, but then he saw Alindra standing in the doorway. Something in his expression softened, and he finally stopped resisting. "Fine," he muttered, "but make it quick." Alindra walked into the medical bay, and the wounded Marines watched her with curiosity. These men and women had just fought a battle that should have been impossible to win, and many of them bore injuries that would have killed a Volante, but they were laughing and joking and teasing each other as if they had just returned from a training exercise. "Your people are strange," Alindra said as she reached James. "So I have been told," he replied, and he smiled despite the pain. The doctors worked on his arm, and Alindra watched as they set the bone and sealed the burns and patched the cuts. James barely flinched, even when the procedure should have been agonizing. "Does it not hurt?" she asked. "Of course it hurts," he said. "But pain is just information, and it tells you that you are still alive." Alindra reached out and took his uninjured hand. James looked at her with surprise, but he did not pull away. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for keeping your promise. The war is not over," he warned her. "The Kethver will return, and they will bring even more ships, and they will not make the same mistakes again." "I know." "Then you know that more battles are coming and more people will die, and this is only the beginning." "I know," she repeated. She squeezed his hand. "But today my people survived, and today we have hope, and today I watched a human stand against impossible odds and refuse to fall." She paused and gathered her courage. "I married you to save my people, and I did not want this marriage, and I expected to resent you for the rest of my life." James nodded, and his eyes showed no offense at her honesty. "I understand." "No," Alindra said firmly. "You do not understand because I am not finished." She took a deep breath. "I watched you today, and I saw what you were willing to do, and I saw what you were willing to become." She reached up and touched his face gently. "You became a monster so that my people could remain innocent, and you became a killer so that we could remain healers." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Why would you do that for strangers?" James was quiet for a long moment. "Because the galaxy needs your people," he finally said. "It needs artists and healers and dreamers and poets, and it needs those who create beauty instead of destruction." He looked down at his scarred and burned hands. "The galaxy does not need more killers, and it has plenty of those already." His voice grew soft. "But it needs someone willing to be the killer so that the artists can keep creating, and that is what humans do." "That is a terrible burden," Alindra whispered. "Yes," James agreed, "but someone has to carry it." Alindra felt something shift in her heart. It was not love, because love takes time to grow, and they had only known each other for a few weeks. But it was the seed of something that could become love. It was respect and admiration and gratitude and a fierce desire to stand beside this man who had given so much for her people. "Teach me," she said suddenly. James looked confused. "Teach you what?" "Teach me to be strong like you, and teach me to fight like you, and teach me to protect those I love. Your people do not fight." "Then I will be the first." James studied her face for a long time, and she could see him thinking and considering. Finally, he smiled. "You may regret asking that." "I do not think I will." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Alindra's life. James taught her how to shoot and how to fight and how to push through pain and exhaustion. He taught her tactics and strategy and how to think like a warrior. He taught her that true strength was not about hurting others, but about protecting what you loved. And somewhere along the way she fell in love with him. It happened slowly, like the sunrise creeping over the horizon. One day she realized that she looked forward to seeing him each morning. One day she noticed that his smile made her heart beat faster. One day she understood that she would do anything to keep him safe. James lived for another 42 years. They were good years filled with love and laughter and the joy of watching the Volante rebuild their civilization. The Kethver returned 3 more times, and each time, they were driven back by the combined strength of humans and Volanti fighting side by side. James fought in every battle until age and wounds finally forced him to step back and let younger warriors take his place. He died peacefully in his sleep with Alindra holding his hand. She lived for another 250 years after that, and she never remarried because she knew she would never find another like him. The Volanti erected a statue of James in the capital city. It showed him not as a warrior, but as the man Alindra remembered best, standing at a window and watching the stars with tired eyes and a gentle smile. The inscription at the base was simple: "He fought so we could dream." Humans continued to spread across the galaxy and everywhere they brought their strange combination of violence and compassion. They protected the weak and challenged the strong and refused to accept any limit on what was possible. Other species learned to respect them, and some learned to love them, but everyone learned to never underestimate them, because humans were always more than they appeared to be, unless depending on whether you were their friend or their enemy. Alindra understood this better than most, because she had seen both sides of humanity. She had seen their capacity for destruction and their capacity for sacrifice. She had seen their fury and their tenderness. She had seen them at their worst and their best, and she had loved them for all of it on her final day. Alindra stood before the statue of James and remembered the night they had first met. She remembered how she had expected to hate him. She remembered how wrong she had been. "Thank you," she whispered to the stone face that smiled down at her, "for everything." Then she closed her eyes and let go. And somewhere across the stars, a human soldier heard the news of her passing and raised a glass in her honor. "To the Volanti princess," he said, "who reminded us that fighting is not the only kind of strength." His comrades repeated the toast, and the legacy of James, Chun, and Alindra of the Volanti lived on forever.